What do the experts know about the rate of speciation, the rate at which new species arise?
We presume that the rate of extinction of 1/10 of a species per million per year that's reflected in the fossil record allows for either equality, or which is calculated on well-known groups like mammals and fishes and mollusks, accounts for the rate of speciation, and the two should be roughly equal or slightly growing with speciation. Raising that to 1,000 or more times the base level at which it was staying relatively even in the past clearly exceeds the rate of speciation.
Thank you very much. A couple of questions. One to Peter, quick question. You spoke about the depletion of the biodiversity in the tropics, but in the arid lands, we really have a very serious problem. The species are disappearing and disappearing very rapidly, and I don't think there is any proper study to understand the level of this complexity and how to remedy it. The second question is for Jane. I know that you don't have that much time to talk about all the challenges, but there is one that is really very serious, as you know very well, and that is the pollution of the oceans. And it's very frightening to see these pictures of the oceans being polluted, especially the plastics, and how this is affecting the fish and industry and all the marine life. And I'm wondering whether you can say a few words about this and whether there is any effort whatsoever to start to remedy this.
I'm not sure I heard your question right, Mohammed. Did you say India?
I meant the biodiversity in dry lands, in arid lands.
We're not...
The arid land biodiversity. What I said, it is disappearing very rapidly. I see this in my own country, but there isn't any proper study that tries to show.
You mean, are we trying enough to inventory the species?
Yep.
Oh,
right.
well, no. We've inventoried about 1.7 million of them, of 12,000 estimated, and could be much more than that, since the time of Linnaeus in the middle of the 18th century. And the time is going very fast. We're not inventorying them, and we, at the same time, are confronted with a great loss in the next 2 generations because forests and other habitats are being destroyed so rapidly. In fact, I would say, based on Jane Lubchenko's very fine comments, that the situation is much worse on land, where forests are going, where all habitats are going, where everything's being used up either within the boundaries of country or beyond them, and the speed of finding out what's there is very slow. By the way, the Indian government is probably in the process of giving a major grant to ATRI to survey the biodiversity in the country much more thoroughly than has been done before. So there are signs of hope.
Mohammed, thank you very much for your question about pollution. We tend to think of pollution in sort of 3 buckets. One is toxic pollution, which used to dominate everybody's thinking, and then we became aware of nutrient pollution, both sewage as well as fertilizers flowing to coastal areas, causing harmful algal blooms, dead zones, etc. The big 800-pound gorilla now are plastic pollution, so each of those is a very significant problem. Plastic pollution has really galvanized public attention, and it's partly because what you mentioned, the images are so incredibly graphic and really gross. I just came from the 5th Our Ocean Conference that was in Indonesia, and I can tell you that there is a lot of attention to this issue now. It has come up very, very rapidly. There's sort of 3 ways people are thinking about the solutions. One is to change the chemical composition of plastic so that, in fact, it is biodegradable. That's really important. Not easy to do economically at scale, but possible, and there's a lot of interest on the part of a lot of companies, and there is a lot of the private sector is engaged in this issue. The second is reducing the flow of the stuff that is waste to waterways, and to the ocean. And most of the plastic pollution that's in the ocean is coming from 5 countries in Asia. It's just massive amounts of stuff. There's a lot of attention to that as well. Not easy, but changing the incentives is going to be key here as well. And then the third is cleaning up what's out there. That is next to impossible because it gets broken down smaller and smaller. And so you might see a lot of, let's clean up the ocean, I have a new gadget. Most of those don't really work at scale. So we have to put the emphasis on the first and the second, and hopefully sooner rather than later.
I would like to address my question to Dr. Rabin and Dr. Labchenko, both of you, regarding the cost of data. For example, like plants, animals, biodiversity, now the genome sequencing, so much going on, not only interspecies, but interspecies, like population genomics, enormous genomic information is coming out. Like ocean metagenomics, marine metagenomics, such a microbial, huge data is coming out. That's so much important for fishery, but also like a sustainable ocean environment. But like NCBI, GenBank, EMBL, EBI, DDBJ, DNA Data Bank of Japan, or Protein Data Bank, now if you see the coming 10 years, maybe 20 years, I think that the cost of data management, of course, if you utilize those data, AI, others, a huge computational, I think, burden will be predicted. So how we can share the cost, how we can manage those costs for data accumulation. Otherwise, those data has been produced, but it may not be useful for that. So I would like to address your comments on the cost of data.
Peter, I'll start and then you can continue. That's a very real concern. There is increasing attention to using genetics, genomics in the ocean. It's a brand new world out there, a lot of things we haven't yet discovered. It is massive amounts of data and data crunching. But I think the real question is not just how to manage the costs of the data, but who's going to own them, and how do we avoid the issue that Bill Clark flagged earlier of privatizing in knowledge to the benefit of a few at the expense of the many. And so there are some very real issues here that we have not yet grappled with.
Obviously, genomic sequencing and barcoding are very easy ways to find out how many species there are, but I almost said when Mohammed asked me about inventory in general, we have to remember that we're in an era of about 2 generations when something up to 20 or 30% of all the species on Earth might be lost. And then you have to note that if you come to something like mites, which have about 30,000 described species, but actually about 1 million species probably there, or nematodes, which are similar, even fewer known, or fungi, which are 140,000 named species, and up to 5 million are estimated to exist. What would you do with the information? In other words, it has to be very well selected what your aim is. To barcode everything in Costa Rica, which is a project that's being discussed, for example, would tell us kind of how many genetically distinct species there were there, but if a great proportion of them were to go extinct by the end of the century, and all we knew about them was a barcode, what would we do? Indeed, one of the major problems of the 1.7 million species that we've named is We know nothing about the vast majority of them, even the ones we've named. So I think the answer would have to be, we have to be very specific in our targeting because the time is so short and we really have to focus on conservation. We really cannot expect the poor countries in the world to clean up their act and start conserving everything like mad while we stand by and point fingers at them. And I did want to mention my paper is printed out and on the table there if anybody wants it.
A question about norms. Both of you called for scientists to take a more active role in reshaping both social and personal norms. I'd like you to say a little bit more about just how that works, because in my experience, mostly when we scientists try to do that, it comes across to others as we are yet again lecturing them on what they ought to do according to our norms. And I would sort of invite the rest of the audience to jump in because we've got two Americans here telling about norms in America, and we've got me here asking the question. And I bet how you make norms work as scientists is culturally dependent.
Mohammed, do you want to answer that? You've thought a lot deeply about this. I'm happy to, but I'm happy to have a broader discussion.
If I may, one thing I really liked, I think this is a very, very important question, Bill. One thing I really liked is to see this new march for science and for science evidence. And that is not only the scientists, but the scientists and the rest of the society coming together and marching together for scientific evidence. This is the result of this Trump business about climate change. But it is moving. And it's not only moving in the United States, we see it in Europe, soon we're going to see it in the developing world. But this is the sort of thing that I think the scientists can actually deliver the message in a very strong way by moving together with the rest of the society.
Very good.
The one thing that I would add to that is simply that the reward structure in the academic institutions, at least in the United States, does not encourage scientists to be engaged with society. It encourages scientists to publish in peer-reviewed literature, to get grants, but not necessarily to take the time that it takes to help problem solve. This is not true in the medical world, but it's true in environmental sciences, for example. And so changing the reward structure in the academic community, I think, is part of making science more accessible, making science more relevant, making science more embedded in society that I believe that we need.
It's a lot better than it was 50 years ago, at least in respect to what Jane just said, and not least because of her great efforts to help people to be able to communicate better. But I would say that it's extremely difficult to communicate these things to poor countries, which most of the countries in the world are poor, because it almost inevitably ends up as lecturing them unless you're willing to put some kind of help for their own personal development and stability and the empowerment of women and the many other important issues that are going on. In the United States, unfortunately, we seem to be dividing into two countries, and one of those countries would regard us as just lecturing to them almost no matter what we did. But as Bill Clark implies, if we don't really try to solve that problem, we're dead. We've got to try to understand other people. We've got to try to communicate with them on their own terms, and that's where I'd go back to Pope Francis's very important words on these subjects, because lecturing people does no good at all. In fact, it probably does bad in the long run.
Again, we have one question here and another there. I don't think we will have time. First one.
I was truly delighted to hear Jane Lubchenko's very optimistic views. How can you reconcile this very hopeful view of your expose with the dramatic news which we hear every day, day after day in our newspapers about the dramatic situation of the ocean?
portray an overly optimistic scenario. I'm trying to balance things out a bit. And I think there is no doubt but that the challenges are unprecedented. They are immense. They're very, very difficult. And what I have found is that focusing only on the problems without giving people something meaningful to do and some reason for hope is not likely to lead to a better place, if you will. And so I don't believe in being just optimistic for the sake of optimism. I'm trying to shine a spotlight on the good solutions that are out there that aren't yet at scale that could be, and if they were, could at least help buy us time. And in recovering ocean ecosystems, there is a wealth of carbon that can be sequestered that helps with climate change, and protecting as much biodiversity in the ocean as possible provides the raw material for natural selection to act upon in the face of a warmer, more acidic, more polluted ocean, which is what we are headed for. And the more genetic diversity that we have, the more likely it is that at least some of those genotypes are going to be able to cope with a warmer ocean, a more acidic ocean. And so we have a bottleneck that is coming. We need as much resilience as possible so that the systems can keep functioning and providing for us. So I'm trying to do this very delicate balancing act of a tightrope without falling off, and it is, the challenges are immense, there's no doubt about it, but I think that there are things that can be done, and we must try.
Thank you. The last question?
I just want to make a comment here. He was asking about genomes for the sequence of the DNA for all these different species. As we know, this is very expensive for a species that don't have a reference genome to start with. So we have a new plan on the center. Actually, we are trying to do what we call 1,000 genomes. It's actually mixing the current sequence techniques with high-C. And with that, you can work with much smaller species. And I think if you don't worry about SNPs, just a base genome like the human genome when it came out, this can be done for a very low price. So we have a complete new website that's called the DNA Zoo, what we have been sequencing, this collaborator of ours have been sequencing various species. So I think if the price goes down, this number is going to become much more available. And I think I think the technology is now in place.
If we can figure out how to embrace people worldwide and express our appreciation and embracing them with love and charity, then collectively we can select individual targets which are very worthwhile. We're in a terrible century now for human race, but if we give up our hope, as Jane insists correctly, if we give up our ability to do things individually in our institutions and collectively, we have no right to call ourselves a human being, much less a scientist. So we need to keep going after it as hard as we can, but the challenges we face would dictate that we have to be very specific and very pointed about what we do. Otherwise, we'll simply be throwing away opportunities that will never, ever occur again.
You want to say something? Okay, well, that finishes very much presentation. Very significant discussion.